Story 1. I'm Lars, and I've spent my whole life in a tiny fishing village on the coast of Nordland, Norway. It's the kind of place where the sea rules everything. You're either hauling nets, fixing boats, or talking about the weather. My father was a fisherman, his father before him, and I suppose I always figured I'd meet the same fate. What we don't talk about much, though, is what else rules the sea. I heard the stories of Draugen growing up. Every kid in the village did. Old fishermen would sit around the docks, gnawing on dried cod, swapping tales about the ghost of the drowned. They'd describe him with dead black eyes like a haddock and a voice that sounded like the wind screaming through the fjords. They swore you could see him on stormy nights, riding half a broken boat like some kind of grim reaper for fools who didn't respect the sea. It scared me when I was little, but as I got older, it just became another tale to keep kids from getting into trouble. At least that's what I thought until that night. It was late October, and the weather had been terrible all week, constant wind and rain. Our little harbor was rough, but I'd promised my neighbor Jens I'd help him retrieve his boat before the real winter storms rolled in. Jens was an older guy, not quite spry enough to handle things on his own anymore, but still stubborn as a goat. I owed him a favor anyway, so I didn't think much of it when he called me that evening. The rain had eased up, but the sky was a swirling mess of clouds, and the waves were restless. The kind of night where everything feels off. Jens met me down by the dock, and I could tell he wasn't happy about being out there. He had this nervous energy, like he was in a hurry but didn't want to show it. "We'll take the skiff out to the mooring," he said. "Quick and easy." The skiff was a tiny thing, barely big enough for two grown men, but I nodded. "Sure, let's get it done." We pushed off, and I started rowing us toward the outer edge of the harbor where Jens's boat was anchored. The wind had picked up again, and the water slapped against the hull in this uneven rhythm that set my teeth on edge. Jens didn't say much, just kept glancing around like he was expecting something to pop out of the darkness. About halfway there, I noticed the silence. The wind was still howling, and the waves hadn't calmed, but there was this absence of sound. No seagulls, no creaking from the docks behind us. Even the oars cutting through the water sounded muffled, like we were rowing into some kind of void. "Lars," Jens said suddenly, his voice low. "Do you hear that?" I stopped rowing and listened. At first I didn't hear anything unusual, just the wind and the water. But then it came, a shriek, high-pitched, almost human, but wrong. It wasn't close, not yet, but it carried over the water like it was hunting us. Jens went pale, gripping the edge of the skiff so tight his knuckles turned white. "Row!" he hissed. "Row, now!" I didn't argue. I started rowing again, harder this time, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. The shriek came again, closer now, and I swore I saw something moving in the distance, a shape cutting across the waves. It didn't make sense, though. There weren't any other boats out that night. No one else would be stupid enough, except it wasn't a boat. It came into view so fast I almost dropped the oars. Half a hull, shattered and splintered, riding the waves like it was alive. The sail, or what was left of it, flapped uselessly in the wind, and standing at the bow was something. I don't know how to describe it without sounding insane. He was tall, too tall to be human, with shoulders that looked hunched and twisted. His hair, or maybe it was seaweed, whipped around his face, and his eyes. God, his eyes were black as the bottom of the sea. No whites, no pupils, just empty voids. And his mouth. It hung open like he was screaming, but no sound came out. Jens muttered something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse, and I saw him pull out a knife from his belt. Not that it would have helped. The thing, Draugen, turned its head toward us, and I swear it locked eyes with me. I felt it, like ice water pouring down my spine. The skiff rocked violently, and I almost lost my grip on the oars. "Don't stop!" Jens shouted. "Keep going!" But it was too late. The thing raised one arm, long, bony, with fingers like hooks, and pointed at us. The shriek came again, so loud this time it drowned out everything else. The water around us churned, and before I could react, the skiff tipped. One moment we were upright, and the next I was in the freezing water, gasping for air. I don't know how I made it back to the surface, but when I did, Jens was gone. The skiff was gone. All I could see was that half-boat circling me like a predator. Draugen stood at the bow, staring down at me with those dead eyes, and for a moment I thought it was over, that I was going to be dragged under just like Jens. But then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The boat, the shriek, the figure, they all vanished, leaving me alone in the icy water. I swam back to shore, half dead by the time I stumbled onto the rocks, and I haven't set foot on a boat since. Story 2, I grew up in a small, tucked-away village in the Dinaric Alps of Serbia. There's nothing special about the place, just steep hills, thick woods, and the kind of eerie silence that presses against your ears when the wind dies down. Everyone here grows their own food, raises livestock, and tells stories that make you lock your doors at night. Most of them are just old wives' tales, but there's one that everyone swears by, the Drekavac. It's not something we joke about. Some say it's the spirit of an unbaptized child. Others call it a demon. Either way, it's not just some campfire story to us. My grandfather claimed he'd seen it once, said it screeched so loud his ears bled. He swore it jumped on a man's back near the river and drove him mad. They found the poor guy days later, babbling nonsense and clawing at his own face. I didn't believe it back then. I figured it was just another way to keep kids from wandering the woods at night. But after what happened to me last autumn, I don't laugh anymore. It started on a Friday evening. I'd been helping my uncle drag firewood back to his barn all day, and by the time I was done, the sun was dipping behind the mountains. My farm is about 3 kilometers from his, so I wasn't worried about the walk back. I've taken that trail 100 times, through the woods past the old well, and over the narrow footbridge that crosses the Drina River. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet where you notice every little sound. The crunch of your boots, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, which wasn't unusual. Most people in the village don't stray far after dark. About halfway home, just as I passed the old well, I noticed something odd. The birds had stopped chirping. Not just birds, everything. No frogs, no crickets, no wind, just silence. I stopped walking and listened. My pulse picked up a little, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a wolf had scared the wildlife off. I picked up the pace, trying to shake the uneasiness creeping up my spine. I was almost to the bridge when I heard it, a soft rustling behind me. At first, I thought it was the wind catching the leaves, but it didn't stop. It got closer, like footsteps, light, careful ones. "Who's there?" I called out, spinning around. Nothing, just trees and shadows. "Is this some kind of joke?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. Still nothing. I tightened my grip on the axe I was carrying. I'd been using it to chop wood earlier. It made me feel a little better, but not by much. I kept walking, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The rustling came back, louder now, keeping pace with me. I broke into a jog. The bridge wasn't far. I figured if I could make it across, I'd be safe. I don't know why. I just had this gut feeling. But as I got closer, the sound changed. It wasn't rustling anymore. It was heavier, almost like something was dragging itself through the brush. Then it screamed. I can't describe the sound without my stomach turning. It was high-pitched, shrill, and full of rage. Like a child wailing in pain, but worse. It wasn't human. I dropped the axe. My legs locked up for a second, and I couldn't breathe. My whole body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The next thing I knew, something hit me from behind. It felt like a sack of rocks had been thrown at my back, and I went sprawling face first into the dirt. Before I could even process what was happening, I felt it. It was on me. Whatever it was small but impossibly strong. Its fingers, claws, dug into my shoulders as it clung to my back. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, hot and rancid like rotting meat. Then it screamed again, right into my ear. I can't explain what that sound did to me. It wasn't just loud, it was inside me. It felt like my skull was going to split open. My vision blurred, and for a second, I thought I was going to pass out. But I didn't. I don't know how, but I managed to stagger to my feet. The thing was still clinging to me, digging its claws deeper. I screamed, thrashing around, trying to shake it off. It was no use. Then I remembered the bridge. I stumbled toward it, half blind with terror and pain. The whole way, the Drekavac kept screaming, its voice bouncing off the trees and stabbing into my brain. I don't know how I made it, but I did. As soon as my boots hit the wooden planks, the thing froze. It let go. I felt its claws slide out of my shoulders, and suddenly the weight was gone. I didn't stop to look. I ran across the bridge as fast as I could, not stopping until I was on the other side. When I finally turned around, the thing was gone. The forest was still silent, but I could feel it watching me from the shadows. I didn't stick around to find out if it would come back. I ran the rest of the way home, slammed the door, and didn't leave the house for 3 days. The scratches on my shoulders took weeks to heal. I told my uncle I'd tripped and fallen into a thorn bush. I didn't dare tell anyone the truth. No one would believe me. Story 3. I was born and raised in a tiny village called Rörby in Sweden, tucked against the edge of a sprawling forest. Most of the kids I grew up with moved away, but I stayed behind, content with the quiet life. I worked as a carpenter, kept a small cabin near the woods, and spent most of my free time hunting or fishing. The forest was home, simple as that. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that something happened out there. Something I still struggle to explain. I'd heard the stories growing up, of course, about the Skogsra, the guardian spirit of the forest. My grandmother used to say she could charm a man with her beauty, but would destroy him if he disrespected her. As a kid, I thought it was all just folklore to keep us from wandering too far into the woods alone. But one crisp autumn evening, I found out differently. I'd been hunting all afternoon and hadn't seen a single hare or deer, not even the sound of a bird. It was as if the forest had gone still, holding its breath. That should have been my first clue to pack up and head home. But I was stubborn. I wasn't ready to admit defeat yet, so I pressed deeper into the trees, farther than I usually went. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, I realized I was lost. My phone had no signal, and the familiar trails had disappeared behind me. It wasn't panic, not yet, but there was this gnawing sense that I'd wandered into somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. That's when I saw her. She was standing just ahead, half hidden behind a birch tree. Long golden hair spilled over her shoulders, and even in the fading light I could see her dress, a simple white gown that seemed out of place in the middle of the woods. "Are you lost?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the empty stillness. She didn't answer, just tilted her head slightly as if studying me. I took a few steps closer, lowering my rifle. Her face was breathtaking, like something out of an old painting, perfect and serene. But there was something off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Miss, do you need help?" I asked again. This time she stepped out from behind the tree. That's when I noticed her back. It wasn't right. Her gown hung open, revealing what should have been skin, but instead it was like a hollowed-out tree trunk, rotted, blackened, and full of gaping holes. I froze, every instinct in me screaming to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She smiled then, slow and deliberate, and began to hum a tune that sent chills down my spine. It was beautiful and haunting all at once, like the kind of song you'd hear in a dream, but forget the moment you woke up. My head felt foggy, like I was being pulled toward her without even realizing it. "Come closer," she said, her voice soft and sweet. I don't know why, but I started walking toward her. It wasn't like I wanted to, I didn't, but my feet moved on their own. The closer I got, the stronger the smell hit me. Damp earth, decaying wood, and something faintly metallic, like blood. "Wait," I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out a hand, her fingers long and pale, beckoning me closer. I could see now that her nails were blackened at the tips, like charred wood. That's when the spell broke. I don't know if it was the adrenaline finally kicking in or some primal instinct to survive, but I turned and ran. I didn't look back, didn't care where I was going. I just ran. Branches tore at my face and arms, and the rifle bounced painfully against my back. But I didn't stop. I could hear her behind me, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. She wasn't running. She didn't need to. Her presence was like a shadow, always just at the edge of my vision, no matter how far I went. By the time I stumbled out into a clearing, my chest was heaving, and my legs felt like they were on fire. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, and dared to look back. She was standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. Her face was calm, almost sad, but her eyes, there was something ancient in them, something that made me feel small and insignificant. "Do not forget," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing like a whisper in my ear. Then she turned and melted back into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't go back into the forest for weeks. And if you ever find yourself in the forests of Sweden, remember this: treat the woods with respect, because you never know who or what might be watching. Story 4. I live in a small town in eastern Kentucky, not far from a place called Paintsville. It's quiet out here, nestled in the Appalachian Hills, where stories of strange things lurking in the woods have been passed down for generations. My family's place is a couple of miles outside of town, tucked next to a winding creek that feeds into a larger river. It's the kind of spot where you don't see many strangers, just neighbors or the occasional lost hiker. This happened in the summer of 2019. It was a sweltering July evening, in the kind of sticky heat that makes you feel like you're melting. I had been out fishing by the creek after dark, something I've done for years. It's peaceful, and the sound of the water helps clear my head. My wife doesn't like me going out alone at night. She says it's dangerous with snakes, wild animals, and God knows what else. But that night, I needed the quiet. The creek was running low from the heat, leaving exposed rocks in places that were normally underwater. I set up my chair near a deep bend where the current slowed, hoping to catch a few small-mouth bass. The moon was bright, almost full, so I didn't even need a flashlight. Everything was lit up in that pale, silvery glow, and I could see the surface of the water shimmering like glass. I'd been sitting there for maybe an hour, listening to the frogs and crickets, when something felt off. It's hard to explain, but the air around me got heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. The frogs and insects went quiet all at once, and the only sound was the creek gently lapping against the rocks. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the water about 20 feet upstream. At first, I thought it was some girl from town, maybe someone who'd wandered too far from the swimming hole upriver. She was facing away from me, her long black hair dripping down her back and catching the moonlight. Her dress, or maybe it was some kind of old-fashioned gown, clung to her as if she just walked out of the deepest part of the creek. "Hey!" I called out, keeping my voice calm so I wouldn't startle her. "You okay?" She didn't move. I stood up, feeling uneasy. "Miss, you need help?" Her head tilted slightly like she'd heard me, but she still didn't turn around. I don't know why, but something about the way she was standing made my stomach twist. It wasn't just that she was in the water at night. It was the way her body looked stiff, unnatural, like she was frozen mid-step. I stepped closer, careful not to slip on the rocks. The water around her legs seemed darker, almost black, like ink swirling out from her. That's when she turned. Her face was wrong. It wasn't just pale, it was almost translucent, like the skin was stretched too tight over her bones. Her eyes were sunken, black as coal, and her mouth, Jesus, her mouth, was full of teeth too sharp and too many. They gleamed in the moonlight as she smiled at me, a slow, deliberate smile that made every hair on my body stand on end. I froze. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She tilted her head again, and this time I swear I heard a low, gurgling laugh coming from her throat. Then she started to walk toward me. The water didn't ripple around her. It stayed perfectly still, even as she moved closer, her bare feet gliding over the rocks. I stumbled back, tripping over my chair and landing hard on the bank. "What the hell are you?" I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. She stopped a few feet from where the water met the shore. Her head tilted one last time, and then she opened her mouth wider than should have been possible. Her jaw stretched unnaturally, the corners pulling back until it looked like her face was splitting in half. That's when I snapped out of it. I scrambled to my feet, leaving my gear and chair behind, and bolted for the house. My boots slipped on the loose dirt as I climbed the hill. but I didn't dare look back. I could hear the creak again, louder now, like it was rushing in my ears. When I got to the house, I slammed the door and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My wife came out of the bedroom, asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was point toward the creek, my hands shaking. The next morning, I went back to get my gear. The chair was there, tipped over on its side, but my fishing pole was gone. The water at the bend looked normal, like nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at that spot, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light or my imagination. But I know what I saw. I haven't been back to that creek at night since. Story 5. I grew up in a small indigenous community in northern Manitoba, surrounded by dense forests and bitter winters. Life there wasn't easy, but it was simple until something happened that I'll never forget. Something that changed the way I look at the woods and maybe even the world. I was 19, working as a junior ranger for the provincial park. It was mostly trail maintenance and checking campsites. Nothing glamorous, but it gave me some independence. Plus, I loved the forest, or at least I did back then. My family used to warn me about things out there, though. Elders would tell stories about the Wendigo during winter feasts, their voices dropping to a whisper as they described the creature. The Wendigo is always hungry, they'd say. It's made of ice and wind, but its hunger burns. As kids, we'd laugh it off. I mean, come on, a monster that eats people? It sounded like a bad campfire story, but by the time this happened, I wasn't laughing anymore. It was mid-January, the kind of cold that feels like knives on your skin. I was assigned to check a backcountry cabin about 15 kilometers into the woods. The cabin hadn't been used in years, but a storm had passed through the area, and my boss wanted me to see if it was still standing. Normally, I'd go with someone, but everyone else was busy, and I figured, why not? It's just a cabin. I started the hike mid-morning, carrying a pack with a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and a two-way radio. The trail was quiet, just the crunch of snow under my boots and the occasional creak of trees bending in the wind. About halfway in, I noticed the silence. Not the kind you get when the wind dies down, but the kind that feels wrong. No birds, no rustling branches, just nothing. I stopped for a moment, looking around, but everything seemed normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, telling myself I was imagining things. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting dark. I didn't realize how slow I'd been moving. The place looked like something out of a horror movie. Weathered logs, snow piled against the walls, and windows so dirty you couldn't see inside. I pushed the door open, and it creaked like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside it was freezing, even colder than outside. My breath hung in the air like smoke as I shone my flashlight around. The cabin was empty, just a wood stove, a rickety table, and a couple of chairs. I checked the roof for damage, peeked under the stove to make sure no animals had made a home there, and was about to head back when I noticed something. In the corner near the back wall was a pile of snow. At first, I thought it had blown in through a crack, but then I saw footprints leading to it. They were huge, twice the size of my boot, and had long, claw-like marks at the tips. My stomach dropped. I crouched down to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it. In the snow were chunks of frozen meat, scattered like someone, or something, had been gnawing on them. And the smell. I'll never forget that smell. It was sweet and rotten, like decay mixed with maple syrup. I gagged and stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard it, a low, rasping breath coming from outside the cabin. It was slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was out there didn't care if I heard them. My heart was pounding as I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. The sound got closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Whatever it was right outside the door now. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but then the door creaked open, just a crack. Through the gap, I saw an eye, milky white, like it was frozen over, and set deep in a face that looked barely human. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its lips were gone, leaving jagged teeth exposed. It sniffed the air, and that's when I realized It could smell me. I panicked and bolted for the back window, smashing through the glass and landing hard in the snow. I didn't even feel the cold. I just ran. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the woods, a horrible shrieking sound like a mix between a scream and a howl. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning and my legs screaming at me to stop. Somehow, I made it back to the main trail, and that's when the noise stopped. The forest was silent again, but this time it felt even worse, like the calm after a predator has made its kill. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. When I told my boss what happened, he just stared at me. Then he said, "You're lucky you got out of there. Next time, don't go alone." That was it. No explanation, no questions, just a warning not to go back. I quit the ranger job a week later and moved south. Story 6, I used to live in the Four Corners region, where New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado meet. My family's land wasn't much, just a small house surrounded by scrub and rock, but it was quiet and I liked that. I worked as a mechanic at a shop about 20 miles out and spent most of my free time either tinkering with engines in the shed or sitting out back, watching the desert at night. The silence was heavy out there, too heavy sometimes. The Navajo reservation was about an hour's drive away, and growing up I heard the stories. Everyone around here did. I didn't think much of them. Tales about skinwalkers, people who had done terrible things to gain the power to change into animals. Coyotes, wolves, owls, whatever they wanted. The stories were always the same. Don't whistle at night, don't go outside alone after dark, and for God's sake, don't trust an animal acting weird. I used to laugh that off. How could you not? But I don't anymore. It was late September just a few years ago, the kind of night where the air is cold enough to make your joints ache, but you're still grateful summer's finally gone. I was sitting out back in an old lawn chair, a blanket draped over my shoulders, sipping on a beer. The stars out there are unreal, so bright you feel like you're falling into them. No streetlights, no noise, just you in the desert. The coyotes had been yipping earlier, nothing new, but after a while they went dead silent. That wasn't normal. Even the crickets stopped. It's like the whole desert had taken a breath and was holding it. I froze too, listening, and then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze. I thought it might have been a coyote again. Sometimes their howls sound eerily human, but this wasn't that. It sounded like a man, and he was calling for help. "Hello? Is someone out there?" I shouted, my voice cracking a little. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind brushing the scrub. I told myself it was a trick of the ears and leaned back, trying to shake it off. But then I heard it again, louder this time. "Help! Please!" It was a man's voice, rough, like he'd been screaming for hours. I stood up, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was coming from the west, toward the edge of my property. There wasn't anything out that way except miles of dirt and rock. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see much past the first few bushes. "Hey," I called again. "Are you hurt? Where are you?" Nothing. I was about to turn back when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something big. It darted behind a juniper bush so fast I barely registered it. My chest tightened. "Who's there?" My voice was louder now, sharper. I shone the flashlight toward the bush, and for a second I thought I saw something crouched there. Something pale, almost human-shaped, but too long, too thin. Its head turned toward me, and I saw its eyes, yellow like a cat's and way too bright. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't what happened next. It stood up. And it wasn't a man. The thing was tall, at least 7 feet. Its skin looked wrong, stretched too tight over its bones, and its face. God, its face. It looked like it had been a person once, but now it was all wrong. Its mouth was too wide, its teeth too sharp, and those yellow eyes didn't blink. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It just stared at me, tilting its head like it was trying to figure out what I was. Then it opened its mouth, and that same voice came out, the man's voice. "Help me!" My legs finally worked again, and I ran. I sprinted back to the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely twist the deadbolt. I grabbed the rifle I kept by the door and backed into the kitchen, trying to steady my breathing. For a while, it was silent again. I started to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That's when I heard the footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, like whatever was out there wanted me to know it wasn't in a hurry. My stomach turned to ice. The doorknob rattled, and I swear to God I almost passed out. Then in the same voice, on Too Human, Too Wrong, it said, "Let me in." I didn't respond. Couldn't. My hands tightened around the rifle, and I aimed it at the door, my finger hovering over the trigger. It laughed. Not a deep, guttural laugh like you'd expect, but a high, raspy sound, almost like a woman's. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt glued shut. The footsteps moved away, toward the side of the house. I heard it scraping against the siding, then the sound of glass cracking. It was trying to get in through the window. I didn't think, I just acted. I fired a shot toward the sound. The rifle's boom was deafening in the small space, and my ears rang so bad I couldn't hear if I'd hit anything. When the ringing finally faded, the silence was back, heavy, crushing. I stayed there until the sun came up, my back pressed against the kitchen wall, the rifle in my lap. When I finally worked up the nerve to go outside, there was nothing. No blood, no tracks, just long, deep scratches in the wood of my front door and the dirt outside my window, like claws. I sold the house a month later, packed up what I could fit in my truck, and left the rest behind. I never went back. You can call me crazy if you want. Hell, I'd think I was crazy if it hadn't happened to me. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget those eyes. Story 7. I was born and raised in a tiny village on the edge of Dartmoor in Devon, England. It's one of those places where the mist hangs thick over the moorland most mornings, making you feel like you're the last person left alive. Growing up, the older folks used to tell us stories about the Curry, a creature that haunts the moors and preys on the unwary. Of course, as kids, we thought it was all nonsense, just a way to keep us from wandering too far. But now, after what I went through, I'd give anything to have believed them. This happened 2 years ago, not long after my mom passed away. I was in a bad place, mentally, emotionally. I'd been avoiding everyone, spending most of my time walking the moors, hoping the emptiness of the landscape would mirror my own and somehow make it all easier to carry. That's where it began. There's a spot out on the moors not far from Tor where the grass grows unevenly around a cluster of weathered stones. Local legend says it's a burial site, though no one knows for sure whose graves they are. I'd been there a few times before, but I never stayed long. Something about the place just felt wrong. That day, though, I didn't care. I sat on one of the stones and stared out at the horizon until the sun began to sink, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. As I stood to leave, I heard something. A whisper, faint as a breeze brushing past my ear. I froze, scanning the empty moor around me. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the distant cry of a buzzard. I told myself it was my imagination and headed back to the village, the sound still prickling the back of my mind. That night, I dreamed of the Curry. It wasn't much, just a flash of a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pull you in. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to laugh it off. "You've been listening to too many bloody ghost stories," I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a dream. Over the next few weeks, things started to escalate. At first, it was little things. A cool touch on the back of my neck when no one was there. A whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. Then it got worse. I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye that vanished when I turned to look. Sometimes I'd hear my mom's voice, soft and broken, calling my name. One night, I woke up to a hand grabbing my ankle. I bolted upright, my heart in my throat, but the room was empty. My leg tingled where it had touched me, a cold that sank deep into the bone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The worst part was how it started to invade my life during the day. I'd be talking to my mate Tom down at the pub, and for a split second his face would change. His eyes would sink, his skin would pale, and there'd be that same hollow stare from my dream. It always lasted just long enough to make me question whether I'd really seen it. I stopped going out after that, too scared I'd see it again. I told myself I was losing it. I even went to the doctor, who chalked it up to grief and anxiety. It's normal to feel this way after a loss, he said. Normal. Right. I wanted to tell him how normal it was to hear something whispering in your ear at night, or to feel it watching you from the corner of the room. But I kept my mouth shut. I knew how it would sound. Then it started talking to me. Not whispers anymore, actual words. It would call my name in a voice that wasn't quite human, low and distorted, like it was being dragged up from a deep well. It told me to come back to the moors. You'll be free if you do, it promised. Just come back. I tried to resist. God, I tried. But the more I ignored it, the more relentless it became. It was everywhere. In my dreams, in the shadows of my house, even in the faces of strangers. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think about anything but the curry. I knew what it wanted, but I was terrified of what would happen if I gave in. In the end, I didn't have a choice. One night I woke up and found myself standing at the edge of the moors, barefoot and shivering in the cold. I don't even remember leaving the house. The mist was thick, swirling around me like it was alive. And in the distance I heard it, its voice beckoning me forward. I don't know how long I wandered. Hours maybe. The mist seemed to swallow everything, and I lost all sense of direction. Every time I thought I was close to the village, the voice would pull me back, promising I was almost there. By the time I realized I wasn't getting anywhere, it was too late. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the damp grass. I couldn't move. The cold seeped into my bones and my vision blurred as exhaustion took over. Then I saw it, standing over me, its face pale and hollow, its eyes like black pits. The Kuri. It crouched beside me, its lips twisting into a grotesque smile. You're mine now, it said, its voice echoing inside my skull. I'll drag your soul to hell myself. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt heavy, like I was already sinking into the earth. The last thing I remember was its hand reaching for me, cold and sharp as frost. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. A farmer had found me lying on the moors, barely alive. They said it was exposure, that I'd gotten lost and nearly died from hypothermia. But I know the truth. The Kuri let me go. Why, I'll never know. Maybe it enjoys knowing I'll spend the rest of my life waiting for it to come back. I haven't set foot on the moors since, and I never will. Story 8. I grew up in a small village near Pietermaritzburg in South Africa. Life was simple, the kind of place where neighbors knew one another and gossip spread faster than the wind. Our home was modest but comfortable, a 4-roomed house with whitewashed walls and a tin roof that rattled during storms. I shared a room with my older brother Themba, and like most families in the area, our beds were propped up on bricks, not for style or convenience, but for protection. My parents always told us about the Tokoloshe. It's a wicked little thing, my father would say as he arranged the bricks under our beds. Short and hairy, with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. It sneaks into your room at night and sits on your chest. If you're lucky, you'll wake up gasping for air. If not, he'd trail off, leaving the rest unsaid. It was enough to scare me stiff as a kid. As I got older, I stopped believing. I figured that Tokoloshe was just a tale to keep kids from wandering around at night. Themba didn't believe either, though we still kept our beds elevated out of habit. But then something happened when I was 17 that made me rethink everything. It was mid-July, the dead of winter. The nights were bitterly cold, and the wind howled through the cracks in our windows. That night, my parents had gone to visit relatives in another village, leaving me and Themba alone. We spent most of the evening in the living room, huddled under blankets and playing cards by candlelight. Around 10 p.m., Themba said he was turning in. I wasn't tired, so I stayed up a while longer, listening to the wind whip against the house. I eventually decided to call it a night and headed to our room. The candle on the dresser had burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Themba was already asleep, snoring softly. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. Despite the cold, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. It was subtle at first, like the kind of pressure you feel before a thunderstorm. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is waking up suddenly. The room was pitch black, the candle long extinguished. The air was icy, and my breath came out in faint, misty puffs. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I noticed it, the weight on my chest. At first, I thought it was just a nightmare. Sleep paralysis, maybe. I'd heard of it before, and it sounded like this. A crushing pressure, like someone sitting on you. But then I realized I wasn't dreaming. I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, they were pinned down as if invisible hands were holding them. Panic started to set in. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It felt like something was squeezing my throat, cutting off my air. And then I saw it. Just above me, crouched on my chest, was a figure. It was small, barely the size of a child, but its weight felt immense. Its skin was dark and leathery, stretched tight over bony limbs. The thing's head was too large for its body, with bulging, glowing eyes that stared straight into mine. Its mouth was wide, filled with jagged yellow teeth. It leaned closer, its breath hot and rancid against my face. I could hear it muttering something in a language I didn't recognize, a low guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The pressure on my chest grew unbearable, and my vision started to blur. I don't know how I managed it, but I forced myself to focus. I remembered my mother telling me once that the Tokoloshe hates light. In a desperate move, I turned my head as much as I could, straining to see the candle on the dresser. The thing noticed. Its muttering stopped, and its glowing eyes narrowed. It bared its teeth in what I can only describe as a twisted grin. Then, without warning, it lunged at my face. Instinct kicked in. My hands shot out, knocking the candle to the floor. It shattered, the sound piercing the silence of the room. For a split second, the thing froze. That was all I needed. I screamed, loud, panicked. It was enough to wake Themba, who bolted upright in his bed. "What's going on?" he shouted, fumbling for the matches on the dresser. As soon as the match flared to life, the thing was gone. Just like that. The weight lifted from my chest and I could breathe again. I sat up, gasping, my heart hammering in my chest. Themba lit another candle and looked at me, his face pale. "What happened?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the floor. The broken pieces of the candle lay scattered there, but something else caught his eye. There, in the thin layer of dust on the floor, were footprints, small, clawed footprints that didn't belong to either of us. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We stayed in the living room, huddled together under the harsh glow of a paraffin lamp. When my parents came home the next morning, we told them everything. My father didn't say much, but he replaced the bricks under our beds with taller ones. My mother prayed over the house, sprinkling salt in every corner and burning a bundle of impefo. I never saw the Tokoloshe again, but I'll never forget that night. I don't care if people think it's just a story or a superstition. I know what I saw, and to this day, I'll never sleep with my bed flat on the ground. Story 9. I grew up in a tiny village in rural Wales, the kind of place where old stories live longer than the people telling them. I never took much stock in folklore, though, at least not until last winter. That was when I encountered something I can never explain, and frankly, I'd rather not try to. My family's cottage sits on the outskirts of the village, nestled against a patch of woods that always felt older than the rest of the land. I'd heard the stories about Irhuchduguta, the tailless black sow, and how she'd devour anyone foolish enough to linger by the fire on Nos Calan Gaeaf, the Welsh Halloween. My mom used to tell us kids the tale when we were small, just to scare us into coming home before dark. And of course, there was Mari Lwyd, the ghostly mare that the men of the village would parade door to door. It was more of a drunken tradition than anything else. At least that's what I thought. It was late November last year when everything happened. Nos Calan Gaeaf had passed uneventfully, but the days were growing colder, and the nights were long and biting. My father had passed away a few months prior, so it was just Mam and me. I'd come back from Cardiff to help her through the winter, though she hated to admit she needed the help. That night, Mam and I had been sitting by the hearth. She was knitting, and I was flipping through an old book. We hadn't spoken much. It was one of those nights where the quiet felt heavy, like the air didn't want to carry words. Around 9, Mam said she was heading to bed. I decided to stay up, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. Then the tapping started. It was faint at first, like the sound of a branch brushing the window. I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind picking up. But then it came again, sharper this time, like knuckles rapping against the glass. I froze, staring at the window across the room. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I told myself it was just the wind or some bird confused by the light, but the pit in my stomach said otherwise. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. I stood slowly, heart hammering in my chest, and moved toward the window. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain. Pulling it back, I saw nothing but darkness beyond the glass. The tapping had stopped. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, but as I turned away, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something white. I whipped back around, pressing my face to the glass, straining to see. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no, there it was, standing at the edge of the tree line, a figure draped in tattered white cloth. I couldn't make out a face, just a pale, hollow shape with something that glinted faintly like bone. It swayed slightly as though caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. My throat went dry, and I stumbled back from the window. "Ma'am!" I shouted, but my voice barely carried. The figure began to move, slowly at first, then faster, lurching toward the house. Its head, or what should have been its head, bobbled unnaturally, as though it were loose on its shoulders. And as it neared, I realized what I was seeing. It wasn't just a figure. It was a mare's skull. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare right at me, and the jaw, lined with jagged teeth, hung open as though it were mid-scream. The tattered cloth draped around it fluttered as it moved, and I swear I heard a faint, high-pitched wail carried on the wind. I backed away from the window, nearly tripping over the rug. My mind raced. Mari Lwyd. It couldn't be. The men hadn't done the tradition in years. Not properly, anyway. It was just an old village story, a bit of drunken fun. But this wasn't fun. This was something else entirely. The tapping started again, louder this time, not on the window but on the front door. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't a polite knock. It was forceful, insistent. I could hear the wood creaking under the impact. "Ma'am!" I screamed again, running for the stairs. She met me halfway down, her face pale as death. "What's going on?" she demanded. Before I could answer, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. We stood there frozen, staring at the door. And then the singing started. It was faint at first, a low, mournful melody that seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. The words were Welsh but old, so old I couldn't make them out. It wasn't the cheerful carol the men used to sing. This was something darker, something that made my skin crawl. Ma'am clutched my arm. "Don't open the door," she whispered, as if I needed to be told. The singing grew louder, more urgent, and the doorknob rattled violently. "Get the poker," Ma'am hissed, and I obeyed, grabbing the iron poker from beside the hearth. The moment my hand touched the metal, the singing stopped. For a long moment we stood there in silence, waiting. Then came the sound of footsteps, retreating slowly into the night. We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the dying fire, clutching the poker and a kitchen knife, flinching at every creak of the house. In the morning, we found the front door smeared with ash and something red, blood, or something that looked like it. And on the ground outside, half buried in the frost, was a single white stone with my name carved into it. I don't know what visited us that night. I don't want to know, but I left the village not long after, and I haven't been back since. Story 10, I've lived in Honolulu my whole life. Born and raised, I've heard all the old Hawaiian legends growing up. The Menehune, Pele, the stories of spirits that walk the land. But the one that always stuck with me was the night marchers. My uncle used to tell me about them when I was a kid, how they're the spirits of ancient warriors. He'd say they march under the cover of night, with drums beating and torches blazing, coming to reclaim their honor or guard sacred grounds. The thing is, when I was little, I thought it was just his way of keeping me from wandering off after dark. I know better now. This happened 2 years ago, during a weekend trip to the Big Island. My girlfriend Kayla and I had been dating for about 6 months at that point, and she wanted to show me around her family's land near Waipio Valley. Her family's been there for generations, Kuleana land, passed down since the old days. It's gorgeous out there, the kind of place that makes you feel like the world hasn't changed in hundreds of years. We drove up early Saturday morning and spent the day hiking and swimming in the valley. By the time we got back to the little cabin on the property, the sun was already sinking low, and Kayla started making dinner. The cabin was old, like plantation-era old, and it sat at the edge of this overgrown field. Beyond that was nothing but forest, dark and dense, the kind of forest that feels alive. After dinner, we sat on the porch, sipping beers and listening to the night. It was one of those perfectly still nights. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the hum of crickets. Kayla started telling me about her family's history on the land, about how her great-grandfather used to see things out in the valley. Shadows, she called them, but she didn't elaborate. I laughed it off, told her she was just trying to scare me, but deep down, it unsettled me. There was something in her voice, like she wasn't joking. Around 9 or so, Kayla went inside to shower, and I stayed on the porch, enjoying the quiet. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, almost like my ears were playing tricks on me. A low, rhythmic thumping. It was so soft I thought it might have been my own heartbeat. But then it grew louder. It sounded like drums. I stood up, peering out into the dark field, but I couldn't see anything. Just blackness and the faint outline of the trees in the distance. The drumming got louder, steady and deliberate, like a heartbeat echoing across the land. I called out for Kayla, but she didn't answer. The sound sent this icy chill crawling up my spine, and I swear the hairs on my arms were standing straight up. Then I saw the light, a faint orange glow flickering in the distance, right where the field met the forest. At first I thought it might be someone with a lantern, or maybe even kids messing around with flashlights, but the light was moving. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like a line of torches weaving through the trees. That's when it clicked. The drums, the torches, the stories my uncle used to tell me when I was a kid, the night marchers. I froze. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like cement. The torches were getting closer, and the drums were so loud now I could feel them in my chest. Boom, boom, boom. Kayla came out onto the porch, towel wrapped around her, and stopped dead when she saw me staring into the dark. "What's wrong?" she asked, but her voice sounded distant, like we were underwater. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing toward the lights. She followed my gaze, and when she saw them, she went pale. "Get inside," she hissed. "Now!" She didn't have to tell me twice. I scrambled inside, slamming the door behind me, and she locked it, bolting it shut like it was going to do any good. I could see the fear in her eyes, and that scared me more than anything else. "We have to turn off the lights," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Close the curtains." I didn't ask why. I just did it, fumbling with the lantern on the table before pulling the curtains shut. The cabin was pitch black now, and all we could hear was the steady pounding of the drums. Kayla grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't look," she whispered. "No matter what you hear, don't look." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We crouched on the floor, huddled together in the dark, and waited. The sound of the drums was deafening now, like they were right outside the cabin. And then I heard the chanting, low and guttural, a language I didn't understand but felt in my bones. It was coming closer. The air grew heavy, like the atmosphere was pressing down on us, and the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The torches were outside now. I could see their flickering light bleeding through the cracks in the wooden walls. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then everything stopped. The drums, the chanting, even the crickets were silent. We sat there in the dark, holding our breath, and then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like boots on the porch. They stopped right outside the door. I could feel Kayla trembling beside me, her grip on my arm like a vice. The door creaked, just slightly, like something was leaning against it. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth. And then it was gone. Just like that. The weight in the air lifted, and the sound of the crickets slowly crept back in. We stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, until Kayla finally whispered, "It's over." I wanted to ask her how she knew, but I didn't. I didn't want to know. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there in the dark, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left without a word. I haven't been back to YPO Valley since, and I don't plan to. Whatever we heard, whatever we saw that night, it wasn't meant for us. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.